Before we get into today's stories, visit dreadsarmy.com to sign up for the Dread Weekly newsletter so you don't miss out on any updates. Also, check out all of the channels in the Dread Network on dreadsarmy.com or in the description below. Thanks for listening. Now let's get to the stories. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Park Ranger James prepared for his evening patrol in Echo Lake State Park. The date was July 12, 2019, a date that would etch itself indelibly in his memory. A seasoned veteran with over a decade of service under his belt, James knew every inch of this wilderness like the back of his hand. He had faced countless challenges in his career. Things like forest fires, rogue wildlife, lost hikers, but nothing had prepared him for the chilling encounter that lay ahead. For the majority of his tenure, James's duties had been routine. They included checking campsites for fire hazards, ensuring that trails were well maintained, and educating visitors about the park's wildlife. But the park had seen some strange events in recent times. Reports of vandalisms and an unusual number of wildlife veering uncomfortably close to visitor zones. Despite these oddities, nothing could have prepared him for the strange creature he was about to encounter on his patrol. Here is the report of how that night unfolded, as told by James. The evening was quiet and unusually chilly for a summer's day. A light mist blanketed the ground, reducing visibility to about 20 yards. The wind was blowing through the canopy, adding to the eerie stillness. That evening, like any other, I was doing my regular ranger stuff. My job was to look after the park. So I started with my usual rounds. The path I take for my patrol goes around Echo Lake. It's a nice spot, usually peaceful, surrounded by thick woods. But it wasn't just about keeping an eye on the visitors. I was also looking out for any sign of trouble in the park. Sometimes we get folks who don't respect the place. They leave trash behind or they mess with trees and plants. That's not cool, so I was checking to see if there's any of that going on. Also, part of my job is to make sure the animals in the park don't get too close to the people. We've got a lot of wildlife here, and while they usually keep to themselves, sometimes they can wander a bit too close to the campsites or the trails. So that's what I was doing that evening. Just my normal route, looking out for the park and the people in it. But as the sun started to set, things began to get weird. It was around dusk when I noticed something unusual. The woods, typically alive with the chittering of birds and rustling of small creatures, fell deathly silent. I also detected a faint, peculiar scent hanging in the air, a mix of damp earth and something rotten. As I turned a bend on the trail, my flashlight beam revealed a startling sight. There, not more than 15 yards away, crouched a figure on all fours. It was about 6 feet in height. Even while crawling, its body pale as bone and starkly contrasted against the dark underbrush. Its face held 2 large black orbs for eyes, void of any emotion, and an open, gaping mouth devoid of any teeth or tongue. Suddenly, a clicking noise echoed in the forest, snapping me out of my shock. The creature producing the sound tilted its head in an oddly curious manner, as if inspecting me. Its eyes glistened ominously in the beam of my flashlight, and its gaping mouth seemed to absorb the darkness around us. The rotten smell grew stronger, making my stomach churn. When I first saw that creature, my heart started pounding like crazy. I've seen a lot of stuff in my time as a ranger, but nothing like this. So I did what any sensible person would do. I started moving away, real slow like. Didn't want to startle the thing, you know? But then, my instincts kicked in. I thought to myself, James, you gotta get out of here and alert the authorities. So I started booking it back down the trail towards my truck. All the while, I'm clutching my walkie-talkie, trying to get a hold of local law enforcement. My fingers were shaking so bad, I could barely dial the number. After reaching my truck and catching my breath, I turned around to look back at the spot where I'd seen the creature. Guess what? It was gone. Nothing left but that creepy, rotten smell hanging in the air. My heart was still racing, but I couldn't see anything else out of the ordinary. The cops showed up a few minutes later after my frantic call. I tried to explain to them what I saw, but it was hard to put into words. They looked where I pointed. They searched around, but they didn't find any sign of the creature. It was like the thing had just vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was like it never existed. I had the goosebumps, and that rotten smell is proof that I hadn't imagined it. But that was it. The creature was gone, and the forest went back to its usual quiet self. Of course, the higher-ups expected me to write up a detailed report. I mean, it's not every day you encounter a strange creature in the park. So, I sat down, still shaken, and tried to put into words what I'd seen and experienced. I stressed the importance of increased vigilance, particularly in the northeast quadrant where I'd encountered the creature. I suggested we up the number of patrol around dusk and dawn. That's when the creature appeared to me, and I figured it might be more active during those times. I even suggested we get some of those fancy thermal cameras installed. If this thing was roaming around, we needed all the tech we could get to track it. But I also felt it was important to let the visitors know about what I'd seen. Now, I didn't want to cause a panic or scare people away from the park. So I recommended we be careful about how we shared this info. Maybe put up some signs warning people to stay on the paths and avoid the northeast quadrant at dawn and dusk. Also, if anyone heard that weird clicking noise I'd heard from the creature, they should report it right away. We could use all the information we could get to understand this creature better. It was a delicate balance ensuring people's safety and keeping them informed without causing too much alarm. In the end, I felt like I'd done what I could. I'd seen something strange, something I couldn't explain, and I'd reported it. Now, it was up to the higher-ups to decide what to do next. I could only hope my encounter would help us be better prepared for whatever this creature was. I had been waiting for this trip for months. Every little thing had been planned right down to what I would eat each night. Since I became a resident of Alaska, I have dreamed of this moment. A solo hunt into the heart of the bush country to track down a bull moose. The weather was perfect, flying into the area where I would hunt. A secluded area that I doubt many people have come to. Many parts of Alaska have seen few people, if any at all. The pilot and I agreed we would meet back at the exact location in 4 days. Hopefully, this would be enough time to hunt down a good-sized moose. The only thing I worried about was if I would get one sooner rather than later. I would have to smoke the meat somehow to protect it from spoiling. This year's weather had been unseasonably warm, and the above-average temperatures threatened to ruin my hunt. There wasn't anything I could do about the weather, but I could at least make the most of it. The first afternoon, I glassed a little bit near camp without success. There wasn't a ton of grizzly sign, which made me hopeful. Trying to preserve the meat would be hard enough, a task made more difficult by the threat of a black or grizzly bear sniffing around camp looking for an easy meal. That night, all 2 hours of it, I slept peacefully in my sleeping bag. I was unaware I had a visitor to my campsite, but it would have been odd if a bear didn't visit my camp. Based on the tracks along the camp's perimeter, a young grizzly visited. Fortunately, it only seemed curious, so it left me alone. On the second day, I hiked to different hills to class the surrounding areas for any moose. At one point, I saw a cow moose off in the distance, but that was about it. At a different time, I spotted a lone cabin about 2 miles away from my camp. I was surprised to see any indication of other humans in the area. I wondered aloud if they were around or if it was a hunting camp for an outfitter. I made a mental note to keep an eye out for anyone, and to keep an eye on the cabin. Some people can be very protective of the area they hunt in. I certainly didn't want to upset anybody, and more importantly, I didn't want to miss out on bagging a moose. I spotted a grizzly off in the distance as I walked back to camp. It must have been that younger grizzly, but it still was a dangerous animal. I kept an eye on it the whole way back to camp. I made sure to hang up all my food high into a nearby tree and cooked all of my food away from camp. Certainly an inconvenience, but every measure was essential to ensure my safety. That night, I was restless. I knew the grizzly was probably near, but it hasn't bothered me. I kept my handgun close at hand just in case. The following day, I saw the bear about 100 feet from my tent. As soon as I spotted it, it took off on a dead run. At this point, it was more scared of me. Hopefully, it stayed that way. It was my last full day of hunting before the pilot returned for me. It was crunch time. Within a few hours, I spotted a nice bull moose about a mile from camp. I made a mental note of its location and began to stalk. The underbrush was thick, which slowed my progress even more. By the time I finally reached the location of the moose, it had disappeared into a stand of spruce trees. I decided to set up my tripod and wait it out. Within 10 minutes, my decision paid off. The bull walked out into the open and a single shot brought it down. I said a small prayer thanks to this beautiful creature and started processing the moose. I would need to take several trips to get the meat to camp. All the while, I needed to keep an eye out for the bear. Halfway through the processing, a figure approached me. It was the man that lived in the cabin that I saw yesterday. He heard the shot and decided to investigate. He was a friendly guy and offered to help. There was only one peculiar thing about the man. He had a long, jagged scar from his forehead down to his cheek. His right eye was a milky blue color. Around his neck hung a claw from a grizzly bear. He told me it came from the one that gave him his scar. With the help of the man, I could get everything back to camp in a few trips. As a thank you, I gave the man a quarter of the meat because I didn't need that much meat anyways. We parted ways and I started packing up in preparation for the next day when the pilot arrived. I slept easy. A ripping noise roused me from my slumber, and I immediately knew it was that damn grizzly. I grabbed my gun and boots. The grizzly was standing on his hind legs, and a paw gripped one of the meat sacks. That was when I noticed the long, jagged scar and milky blue eye. I aimed and took a shot at grizzly. With a roar of pain, the grizzly ran off into the underbrush with one of the meat packages. A wounded bear is dangerous, but I wanted to ensure I finished it. I began to track the bear by following the blood trail until I came across something that made me stop dead. The bear tracks turned into human tracks. I know it sounds crazy, but the tracks did turn into human tracks. One can see the transformation as the thing walked. One track had the heel of a man and the claws of a bear before the claws disappeared for the next track. I recalled my grandmother's story when I was a young lad. There were powerful people in this world that could transform into any creature they wanted to. Just as long as they had a part of an animal with them, that memory made my blood run cold. In the distance, I could hear the plane approaching. It was time I left this godforsaken place and left it behind for good. I didn't know what was happening, but I didn't want to stay either. I didn't say anything to the pilot other than I had the worst luck. I told him a bear stole 2/3 of my kill before I could chase it off for good. I didn't say anything about the bear turning into a human, and I wouldn't tell another soul. At least until now, anyway. Hi. Before I really get into my story, I'll give you a little bit of backstory and info on me. I'm a 33-year-old software developer. I moved here to Mississippi to help with a software company, but originally I'm from California. I have been blessed with a beautiful wife and 3 boys. They're all my pride and joy. And because of this, I firmly believe in hard work and good traditional living. Doing good works, being a good person. I also believe that when you die, no questions asked. And if it's not your time, well, it's not your time. So one summer, my brother and his family came to visit. I decided to take my sons out shooting with my brother and his 2 boys. All these boys are aged between 9 and 14, so you can imagine it was quite boisterous and lots of energy. It was a good day out until something happened. I believe there's evil in this world, and what we encountered that day was something not of this world. This was sinister, diabolical, completely from the pits of hell. Something that even my prayers wouldn't keep us from, which for me is saying a lot. Let me get to the story. So we were walking through the woods. I had my rifle in hand. The kids were running around playing tag, and myself and my brother were telling them to be quiet, listening to all the sounds to observe. They eventually did settle down, but were still goofing around. I kept rolling my eyes, hoping they would learn something from two older guys. My boots were crunching against the forest floor, and I raised my rifle for any hint of movement, or possibly a boar that we could shoot. As the day progressed, one of my boys spotted a deer in the distance, a beautiful white-tailed deer that seemed to dance before us. It hopped and skipped a little in a maze of trees, and we pursued it. Not to kill it. We didn't have any tags for it, but we just wanted to see where it would go. Then we stopped suddenly and abruptly. This deer that we were chasing was lying dead on the ground about 25 feet away from us. I was going to use this opportunity to teach my boys about tracks, but this deer was already dead. Its abdomen tore open, and its innards pouring out, giving blood all around it. It looked like a mess that you'd see in a horror movie. My youngest son screamed and hid behind my leg. Feasting on this deer was a large creature that resembled a wolf, easily the size of a bear. In fact, I even thought it was a bear at first, until it stood up and was towering over me. And I'm 6'2". This thing was double my width, full rippling muscles, kind of like a gorilla, only bigger, vaster in all proportions. Its hands even reminded me, and body even reminded me of a gorilla, but the head was all wrong. It had a head like a dog. I can't really describe to you what it looked like, but maybe a jackal if I had to guess. But it was black, thick, dark fur. I tried to erase the memory from my head, but the face of this thing was so fierce, so evil. This wasn't normal. There are no normal animals in the woods that stand upon two legs that look anything like this. It had two protruding canines out of its sunken mouth. After maybe not even a minute passed, and this thing turned to look at us, as if giving us a signal with its facial expression to not come any closer, to leave it alone, that it's eating. It had a very annoyed expression on its face and just looked at us in an intense glare. My kids crying, and me and my brother terrified. We slowly backed away as much as we could till it was completely out of view, where we very quickly made our way back to our car, hung up all of our equipment, and drove home silently, almost feeling traumatized, broken, violated. My boys didn't need to see that. They have no idea what they even saw, and I was bombarded with question after question, worried that this thing would come back home to where we were, in our safety, and get them. Or worse, follow us. I had to assure them that this was something else. This was not going to come back and get us. But since then, my son has lost all interest in things, and now spends his time drawing and withdrawn. I believe they have some serious trauma issues from this. I too have bouts of anxiety and panic attacks for the first time in my life. It's the not knowing what we saw that is the most troublesome. I almost wonder if I will ever feel okay. I still see this creature, its face ripping open that deer, and it makes me break down sometimes. I haven't really explained this to my wife because what do I even tell her? I don't even know what's wrong with me. I feel like this experience has changed me, like I'm marked, whatever that means. If you have encountered this creature yourself, I would love to hear it and share my experiences with you. I had taken up trail running to try to get in better shape. I had been an avid hiker my entire life, but my metabolism dropped like a rock in my mid-20s and my leisurely hikes just weren't cutting it anymore. I'm a very goal-oriented person, so I set myself a goal of running at least 1 mile every day, no matter what. I hadn't missed a day since I started in the spring and I was feeling better than ever. Even when it was pouring rain, I ran at least a mile. There was a great state park about 10 miles away from my house. The trails were well maintained and well marked. Some were in the forest and others were along these rolling prairies. All the trails were color-coded and ranked by difficulty at the trailheads. Spring and summer went great, but we were moving into fall now. I still maintained my goal of running at least 1 mile per day, but the days were getting shorter and I found myself running in the dark after work on weeknights. I wouldn't say I'm afraid of the woods after dark, but I usually got my mile in and then went home. I would run longer on weekends to make up for it. There were really only 2 trails that were short enough for my after-work runs. The Red Trail and the Purple Trail. The Red Trail goes through dense forests and had some significant inclines, while the Purple Trail was fairly flat and followed along the edge of a very lazy river. My daily goal was a mile of hills or a flat mile. It didn't matter. A mile was a mile. So more often than not, I ended up on the Purple Trail. The Purple Trail was an out and back trail with a small loop on the very end. Like a lollipop. An easy mile. I had never experienced anything strange there before. I was always a bit uneasy after dark, but mostly because I couldn't see other people until I was right next to them. I would take my headphones out so I could hear better. During my daylight runs, I always kept them on. One day, I was running along the Purple Trail and listening to the sounds of the nearby river. The sun was setting, but hadn't gotten totally dark yet. It would be dark on my way back, but I still had a tiny bit of light left. The first thing I noticed was the smell. There was a sudden putrid smell that seemed to come out of nowhere. It's hard to describe. It was musty, maybe moldy smelling, kind of like rotting fruit or garbage. It didn't smell like a dead animal or anything like that, but it was pretty unpleasant. I just sort of held my breath and ran past it. I had to do that sometimes when dead fish would wash up along the riverbank. The downsides of hiking next to rivers. I left the smell behind as I continued my run. I knew I would have to go back that way, and I hoped it was gone by the time I returned. I didn't notice anything off or strange the rest of my run, but when I returned to the spot with the smell, it had grown even worse. I could barely get past it without gagging. It smelled like a wet garbage dump right in the middle of the forest. Also, it was darker now. The only light came from my headlamp, cutting through the darkness, but not quite reaching far enough to see anything. Eventually, it got so bad that I stopped and looked around trying to find the source of the smell. Then my heart skipped a beat. Up in the trees, I saw two eyes shining back at me, reflecting the light from my headlamp. The eyes were maybe 30 feet away from me. At first, I was caught off guard, surprised by what I saw, but I quickly told myself that it was just an animal. After all, I was in the forest and animals lived here. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then I heard it move. The sound was loud and heavy, and I could hear the tree limb cracking underneath its weight. Whatever it was enormous. I saw the branches shake as the creature seemed to come down the tree. My mind immediately jumped to the conclusion that it was a bear. Bears could be dangerous, especially if surprised, so I knew I had to act quickly. I recalled what I had learned about dealing with black bears. Standing my ground, I started yelling and waving my arms to look bigger and more threatening. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I kept my light pointed at the creature, trying to make out what it was. Then, something strange happened. As the creature came into view, I noticed its fur. It wasn't the dark black of a bear, but rather a gray, shaggy coat. The more I looked, the more wolf-like it appeared. But that didn't make sense. Wolves didn't climb trees, and they certainly didn't smell like garbage dumps. This was something else. Something wild and unfamiliar. Fear and curiosity mixed within me as I continued to watch the creature. It moved with a strange grace, powerful and yet cautious. Its eyes never left mine, and I could feel a connection, a primal understanding between us. But I also felt a warning, a sense that I was close to something unknown and dangerous. I took a step back, still watching the wolf-like creature. I ran all the way back to the parking lot, got in my car, and locked the doors. I was terrified and out of breath, so I sat in my car for a moment to regain some composure. It was a moment too long because I started to smell that smell again. I put the car in drive and tore out of the parking lot, but before I got back on the road, I had to turn towards the trailhead. My headlights pointed straight down the center of the trail I came from, and I saw the flash of eyes reflected back in my headlights. I didn't stay to get a better look at it. I drove out of there as fast as I could and never went back. To this day, I've never run in that park again. Hey Donovan, I love your channel and always listen to your videos before bed. For some reason, the crazy encounters people have with paranormal creatures soothe me and make me feel more sane. I want to tell you about something that happened to me a couple years ago. To this day, I haven't told another soul this story, but I'm curious to know what you think of it. I was making a cross-country trip to visit my parents. It was a very dark night as I drove down the winding roads of Connecticut. I was making pretty good time and was hoping to get to their house before too late. I remember as I was going around this wide turn, I saw 3 wild dogs run into the road and stop dead in their tracks. I slammed on the brakes and was able to stop well before hitting the dogs. I sat there watching the dogs for a while as they didn't run off. There they were in the middle of the road staring at me in the car. I honked at them trying to encourage them to run away, but they just kept looking at me. About a minute went by and all 3 of them, with their heads lowered close to the ground, started walking towards me. As they got closer, I realized that these weren't normal dogs or even wolves. They were something else entirely. They had these insane red eyes that glowed brightly in the dark and were huge. They were snarling and growling, and the creatures started spreading out strategically, looking like they were going to try to attack. I had never seen anything like these creatures before in my life. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and a feeling of pure dread washed over me. Even in the safety of my car, I began fearing for my safety as these things meant business. I thought about flooring it towards the beast, but they were so much bigger than any dog I'd ever seen, and the impact would assuredly render my car undrivable. Seeing no other option, I put the car in reverse and hit the gas. The dogs, or whatever they were, began to run after me, keeping pace with the car easily. No matter how fast I went, they stayed right in front of me, seeming to almost glide across the pavement. They showed no signs of tiring. After a few minutes of this, I came to an intersection and aggressively whipped the car around and tore off down the road. I was able to put some distance between me and the giant demon dogs, and I felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. I was able to take an alternate route safely to my parents' house, but I never forgot about this encounter. The thing I remember the most about these beasts were their eyes, incredibly wide and as red as embers in a bonfire. I remember looking at their eyes and just knowing I was in danger. I've been encountered by wild animals before, and usually there is an element of fear that you can clearly see. In these black dogs' eyes, there was no fear, and it was clear that they would enjoy killing me. Part of me wondered if it wasn't me. They wanted to eat, but my very soul. I've researched these creatures obsessively, and it turns out I'm not the only person to have an experience with these demon dogs. Most people refer to them as hellhounds, and I remember reading about this crazy event back in 1577. During this encounter, apparently a hellhound broke through the door of a church and savagely killed several members of the congregation. It was reported to have even caused the roof of the building to fall to the ground. For centuries, stories of hellhounds have been told along the east coast of England. These fearsome beasts are said to be black with eyes like saucers, and often travel in packs led by men on horseback. Though the stories have largely spread through word of mouth, the earliest written record of a hellhound dates to the 11th century. Could these creatures be more than just legend? If you ask me, I don't know what else I could have possibly seen that night. What makes these stories so fascinating is that they have persisted for centuries, despite there being no concrete evidence that such a creature exists. There are many theories as to what the hellhound might be, ranging from a natural phenomenon to a supernatural being. Some believe that the hellhound is simply a product of overactive imaginations, while others believe that it is an omen of death or an otherworldly creature sent to terrorize us. I was never particularly interested in the paranormal, but this experience shook me to my core. I've dealt with some evil people in my life, but I've always viewed animals as saintly and innocent. No longer those demon dogs were pure evil, and I believe them to be under the control of Satan himself. I've often wondered why they would come after me. Was it a warning my father was going to die? Was I being punished for something that I did in a previous life? Was it something I did in this life that I haven't repented for? I've had a religious bone in my body, but seeing those ghoulish creatures has made me rethink everything. I wonder if I will ever see something like that again. I hope not. Thanks for listening to my story, Donovan, and thank you for giving a voice to those who fear being subjected to ridicule. It's been healing being able to get this off my chest.